As soon as the pregnant woman walked out of the hospital, she saw a horrifying scene. A woman was smashing her head against the glass window. They rushed forward to stop her, but just at that moment, she suddenly turned her head and glared fiercely at them. As she ran away in fear, she got into her sister's car right after leaving the hospital. At that time, they had no idea that a terrifying plague had already spread throughout the city. Before they could figure out what was happening, Mallory's phone rang, and when she turned to grab it, her sister suddenly saw something. Said Mallory. Mallory said her sister's expression turned strange and she began muttering to herself. She was terrified, and when she noticed her sister suddenly stepping hard on the gas, she took control of the wheel just in time. In the end, both of them were unharmed, said Mallory. However, when she got up, her sister was already standing in the middle of the road. Before Mallory could be sad, she noticed people were running for their lives. There were casualties all over the street, and before long, someone knocked into her. Fortunately, a kind woman ran out of a building. Mallory said that just when the woman was about to help her up, the woman took a glance into the distance, and in an instant, she looked possessed, with her eyes turning vacant. The woman then sat in a car about to explode, and a passerby rushed over to help her up. No matter how hard they knocked on the door, the people inside refused to let them in. However, a bald man inside glared at her angrily, adding that the woman who committed suicide earlier was his wife. She saw something terrible and killed herself, but in this disaster, personal grudges had to be put aside. Soon, the room was crowded with people, and fear was written on everyone's faces. They all tried to call their families but received no response. The black man said there seemed to be an evil spirit wandering outside. If you saw it, you would go crazy and eventually kill yourself. He suggested they cover all the windows, said Mallory. At that moment, the president's voice came from the TV, saying the entire country was now in a state of emergency. The illness had spread from other countries, and he urged everyone to stay in their homes. However, the signal cut off before he could finish. A few days later, they were discussing the food issue. The homeowner had taken in too many people, and food was running out. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and everyone became tense. They didn't know who was outside. The bald man insisted they shouldn't open it, but the black man and Mallory felt they shouldn't leave people to die. They asked the person outside to cover the light, and Mallory aimed her gun at the door. If the person wasn't sane, she would pull the trigger. It turned out to be a pregnant woman wearing an eye mask. Everyone was finally relieved. The woman said she had been starving for days and had no choice but to knock on doors until she found this place. But now, there was another mouth to feed, and the urgent problem was food. They didn't know what was happening outside. The homeowner had an idea since he had installed many cameras nearby. If they could observe the outside through the screen, maybe they wouldn't be affected. To ensure everyone's safety, the homeowner suggested they tie him up. If it worked, everyone could go outside. If it failed, they could prevent him from hurting others. Everyone thought it was too dangerous, but the homeowner decided to take a gamble, said Mallory. There was no other option. At first, everything seemed fine, but after a while, a strange breeze passed by on the screen. Suddenly, a ghostly shadow appeared. The homeowner, who seemed normal, began to change. They heard banging upstairs and rushed into the room. Even though the homeowner was tied up, he still went mad and smashed his head against the table. Seeing this, everyone fell into despair. A few days later, all the food was gone. If they didn't find more, they would starve to death. The heavy-set man suggested they go to the supermarket where he worked, but he refused to lead them there. The bald man was the first to volunteer. Even the two pregnant women wanted to go. The black man had an idea. They could paint the car windows black, and use navigation and collision warning to get to the supermarket. When they went outside, they realized it was scarier than they thought. The car shook violently, and they were terrified as they heard something overhead. At a crucial moment, Alex floored the gas pedal and drove through obstacles. Fortunately, they arrived safely at the supermarket, and they quickly took supplies. They returned with the supplies, thinking they would be fine for a while, but that night, the pregnant woman opened the door and let a strange man in. Mallory shouted, "Libby, what are you doing? What are you doing?" Mallory shouted again. After just one glance outside, the woman went mad. She held her child and tried to jump out the window to commit suicide. Her friend nearby quickly grabbed the baby, but before she could stop her, she hid under the blanket in fear. Meanwhile, an old lady tried to fight a man but was forcibly made to open her eyes. After seeing the evil outside, the old lady stabbed herself in the neck with a pair of scissors. The old lady instantly fell dead, and the man then set his eyes on Mallory, who was under the blanket, tempting her to look. "Give me the children, and I will take them away," said the man. Just at the critical moment, the bald man arrived with a gun. He was afraid of seeing the evil spirits, so he kept his eyes closed while firing. He only managed to hit the man's shoulder, but by that time, the man had already lost his sanity. They struggled and both fell down the stairs. and even used his last bit of strength to kill the bald man. Fortunately, Mallory's husband woke up at that moment, and they fought over the shotgun. She heard a gunshot from inside the house, and she was trembling in fear. Luckily, it was her husband who had won, and she and the children were finally saved. 5 years passed quickly, and they raised the 2 children together. To survive, they had to wear blindfolds when outside. They searched for food while keeping their eyes covered, knocking on things to determine if their surroundings were safe. As their food supplies dwindled, they kept seeking help from the outside. After countless disappointments, one day, the walkie-talkie carried by Jack finally crackled. A voice on the other end said there was a refuge downstream, and they could find it by following the sound of birds. Mallory thought it might be a trick by the evil spirits and doubted such a place could exist in this dark world, but Jack believed they were running out of options. They had a big argument over it. They went out as usual to find food a few days later, and unexpectedly found a house on the mountain. Though it seemed deserted, it had everything they needed. Things were looking up until they heard a car outside. They were surrounded by cult followers of the evil spirit. Jack knew it would be difficult for them all to escape, so he decided to lure them away, allowing Mallory and the children to flee. Outside, the cultists kept trying to make Jack open his eyes. During their confrontation, they noticed Mallory and the children escaping. Jack decisively shot 2 of them but got shot himself. When the cultists discovered Mallory and the children, Jack removed his blindfold to save them. Soon after, Jack saw what he had been trying to avoid all along. His expression twisted, but he fought with the last bit of sanity left in him, shot the man, and then took his own life. Back at home, Mallory was devastated. But she still had to care for the 2 children. She decided to set out for the refuge, even though the journey required traveling through 2 days of rapids. At a critical point, one person would have to look at the water. This meant one child would have to be sacrificed for the others to reach safely. Though the girl wasn't her biological child, she couldn't bear to sacrifice anyone. So, she decided to leave it up to fate. The next day, they set off blindfolded. She kept reminding the children not to take off their blindfolds, no matter what happened. Soon after, they heard a man's voice at sea, trying to convince the children to remove their blindfolds. Mallory frantically covered the children, holding up her gun. She could hear the voice getting closer, but couldn't determine where it was coming from. The man tried to force her to open her eyes. She fought back, shaking the boat. Finally, she pulled out something she had prepared and swung it wildly until she managed to escape. After countless twists and turns, they managed to reach the shore. In her confusion, she tripped over a branch, and the 3 of them were separated. After searching desperately, she found her son but not the girl. The girl, who was left alone, once again heard the voices of the spirits. They tried to convince her to take off her blindfold, and Mallory called out desperately to her. Mallory said she knew she had been harsh on them, but everything she did was for their safety. Now, there was just one last stretch left, and she hoped the children wouldn't give up. Hearing Mallory's voice, the girl finally returned to her side. However, the evil spirits were still close behind. Mallory picked up the children and ran through the forest. She couldn't see, but she kept running along the forest path. Finally, they heard the sound of birds not far away, and found the community. She started knocking on the door and shouted for it to be opened. But the people inside did not open the door in fear. Finally, the door opened slowly, and I was able to get inside. They checked their eyes and confirmed they were all normal. She then removed her blindfold and realized this was a school for the blind. Since they couldn't see, most of the people there had survived. Seeing the long-lost laughter and sunlight, she had finally reached a true haven. The film ended there.